Welcome to Channel 24. I'm Sofia Nazarenko and great to have you with us. Big moves are happening this week and big silence too. While Donald Trump publicly demands that Russia end its war in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin is pretending not to hear a thing. Still, behind the scenes, things are moving fast. U.S. Special Envoys Kellogg and Steve Witkoff are heading to Kyiv and Moscow right now. So what's really going on and what could happen after the 8th of August? To break it down, I'm joined by Jamie Shea, former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. Good morning and welcome to the studio.
Good morning to you, Sophia, and thanks very much for having me on the program this morning.
Mr. Shea, one of the hottest questions right now is what might happen on the 8th of August when Trump's ultimatum to end the war expires. But what I'm actually more curious about is that what does the 9th of August look like for Trump, especially when he wakes up and sees that Putin hasn't stopped the war?
Well, I think it's a pretty sort of good guess, Sophia, a pretty safe guess that Putin is not going to end the war on Friday, the 8th of August. The Russians, in fact, on the contrary, feel that they now have the advantage, particularly capturing more, unfortunately, of Ukrainian territory. They're on a roll. And so I don't think Putin has a strategic incentive at the moment to stop, which means that, of course, Trump then has to go ahead with his commitment to respond to that Putin isn't willing to cooperate with him and impose sanctions. And I hope very much that is the strong message that Steve Witkoff is going to carry to Putin when he sees him either tomorrow or Friday in the Kremlin. The question, though, is that will Trump really be prepared to impose harsh sanctions, not just on Russia, but particularly the so-called secondary sanctions on countries like China, Turkey, India that buy large quantities of Russian oil? And will he have prepared something? Because, you can't simply improvise sanctions. They're complicated things. You need teams of lawyers and economists to work out how you're going to implement them. So has he got something already prepared, ready to go ahead, or is he going to take months deliberating over what he in fact intends to do? And that pause in actually implementing sanctions would, of course, give Putin even more breathing space, room for maneuver to continue his advance in Ukraine. But Trump has really linked his credibility to this frustration that he's been expressing recently with Putin's continued bombardment of Ukraine, unwillingness to cooperate with him, deceiving him. And so really, I think Trump's credibility is now on the line that he's going to do what he says and step up assistance to Ukraine and implement much tougher sanctions on Moscow. But of course, as always with Trump, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we're just going to have to wait and see what happens.
Yeah, talking about the sanctions, that's very, very interesting question because we don't know what kind of sanctions we actually could expect from Trump because I think there is any official announcements had been done by Trump, but I know that today White House just published an announcement of Trump's statement for today's evening, so maybe it's a sign.
Well, certainly Trump has suggested that he's going to get tough on India. He's been speaking about India really almost exclusively this week. Not much on China, not much on Turkey or other countries that trade with Russia or import Russian oil and materials. And he's imposed a 25% tariff already on India and suggests that this could be even higher, particularly after yesterday, Ukraine announced that it had discovered Indian electronic components in missiles and drones that Russia has been using to attack Ukraine. So it certainly suggests a much higher degree of Indian involvement in the conflict than simply importing large amounts, nearly 2 million barrels of Russian oil. But of course, the problem there, as with China, as with Turkey, is that India is an important trading partner of the United States. Trump wants to get more access to the Indian market, particularly for American agricultural products. India and the United States have been cooperating on space. So to what extent is he really going to be prepared, if you like, to sacrifice good relations with China or Turkey or India because of Russia and because of Ukraine? Will he stick to those draconian sanctions that he has announced? The other thing, of course, is will countries like India and China actually change their behavior because of the threat of Trump sanctions? India, which has a reputation, of course, for fiercely guarding its independence, was pretty clear yesterday that they're not going to give in to Trump's pressure because they need the Russian oil, which is cheap and very important for their economic development and for their energy industry. So it's one thing to threaten sanctions, but it's another question whether the countries that are threatened feel sufficiently threatened that they're going to change their behavior and break their relations with Russia. There's not been any evidence of that thus far.
Talking about Russia's economy, Donald Trump seems convinced that Putin will stop the war if oil prices drop by another $10. Sure, Russia might slow down when it runs out of money, but how close are we really to that scenario? And more importantly, can we actually expect, as you said about sanctions, like very, very strong sanctions and strong enough to make that happen?
Well, the thing about sanctions, Sophia, is that they do work, but they work very slowly. There's no sort of overnight sort of big strike, if you like, with sanctions. They often take years, particularly against large countries like Russia that have borders with many countries, trading relations with many countries, lots of possibility to avoid the sanctions, as you see with the Russian shadow fleet to transport its oil around the globe. And what really counts is Russian war production. And there the evidence is, unfortunately, that Russia has, despite the sanctions, preserved an enormous capacity for war production. And they're now producing nearly 200 drones every day at their plant in Tatarstan. They've doubled their production of ballistic missiles from 44 a month just 1 year ago to now nearly 90 a month. And since Trump returned to the White House in January, believe it or not, despite his statements that he can put pressure on Putin and make peace with Russia, the number of Russian drones and missiles that have been fired against Ukraine has doubled under Trump vis-a-vis the Biden administration. The statistic which I looked up is about 11,500 in the last 6 months of the Biden administration to nearly 28,000 in the first 6 months of Trump's administration. So the threat of sanctions has not so far convinced Putin to slow down his attacks against Ukraine, and Russia has shown this ability to maintain very, very high rhythm of war production. So yes, over a period of time, if the sanctions were really comprehensive and effective, particularly against, as I say, countries that trade with Russia or supply Russia with important missile components, electronic components, it would slow Russia down. And Russia has been depending on oil to get about $145 billion a year in earnings, which of course have fueled the war. But the problem is that Russia has a large production capability, a large treasure chest, if you like, so that that's not going to happen in the next year or two. So the only way to stop Putin is to supply Ukraine with weapons, to stop Russia on the battlefield, to inflict greater military losses on Russia, and to prevent Putin believing that he can win the war. Then he will, I think, change his calculus. So I'm afraid this is a military issue, to my mind, far more than an economic issue.
Right before our interview, headlines exploded with talk that Putin might offer an air truce, no flight attacks, but no end to the war, just in order to please Trump. And even Lukashenko brought it up during his meeting with Putin, and then they talked to the press. But I'm here in Kyiv, and last night, I think as usual, Russia was bombing Ukraine again. So should we take these truce reports seriously at all? I mean, if Moscow really wanted to stop the strikes, it could do that anytime, right?
Yes, we've been here before, Sofia, as you very well know, better than I, being in Kiev. Putin has offered these temporary sort of halts to the air bombardment, normally associated with Easter or Christmas, some sort of religious holiday. They've only lasted a couple of days. In the meantime, Ukrainians have reported that Russian strikes have continued on parts of Ukraine despite these truces, although maybe not so much Kiev or Lvov or Kharkiv or Kherson, the big cities, but more in the east. But of course, Putin has often associated these truces with lots of conditions imposed on Ukraine, unacceptable conditions that, for example, Ukraine would have to stop recruiting soldiers during this period, or would not be able to receive any more Western weapons or support, or Ukraine would not be able to bring reinforcements up to the front line. And so, of course, Putin would try to use this pause not for a real ceasefire, but simply to gain a military advantage before the aggression starts again. So we'll have to be very careful. The devil is always in the detail here. But there's another thing that makes me skeptical, quite frankly, which is that at the moment, again, unfortunately, Putin is having some success with the aerial bombardment. He's able to fly 400, 500 missiles and drones against Ukraine virtually every evening. He knows that Ukraine's air defenses have been seriously depleted. He knows that the Patriot systems promised by Germany, United States and others will take time to arrive, to set up. So he knows that he's getting an advantage with this at the moment. And once Putin feels he has a military advantage, he doesn't give it up very easily. So while Ukraine rebuilds its air defenses with Western support, the American weapons, the new European packages that are due to arrive, he probably feels that this summer is a good opportunity to press that advantage home. So I'm skeptical about this. These are normally more for propaganda purposes than being sincerely intended.
This week, two big visits are on the agenda. Kit Kellogg is coming to Kyiv, and Steve Witkoff is already arrived to Moscow. What are your expectations from these talks? And let's be honest, is Witkoff really going to wait another 8 hours again for Putin to show up? Or do you actually think that this meeting even happen at all, or he will just meet with Putin's administration?
Well, I think it would be an insult to Trump for Putin not to receive Witkoff, and Putin's always received him in the past because I think Putin wants to keep his good relationship with Trump if he can, but of course not at the price of stopping his aggression in Ukraine. I think if Putin has a choice between good relations with Donald Trump and winning in Ukraine, he sees his political future much more bound up with what he would call victory in Ukraine. I think that's pretty clear by now. But on the other hand, he's not going to needlessly provoke Trump by refusing to receive his envoy. But what worries me is that this meeting, like many of the previous ones, doesn't seem particularly well prepared. There's not been any sort of diplomatic contacts before the meeting. There's no agenda. Normally with these type of meetings, you have a set of agreements or deliverables worked out in advance. Witkoff also has been overwhelmingly focused on the Middle East in recent days. He's been in Gaza, he's been in Doha, in Qatar. He's been very much focused on Israel and the Gaza situation. So psychologically, politically, how well is he prepared now to switch his attention back to Ukraine? It may simply be a question of Trump sending Witkoff to Putin simply to give Putin a kind of ultimatum about the end of the war in Ukraine. And when, of course, Putin will politely reject this, then Trump may feel he has sufficiently good grounds to go ahead and impose the sanctions, but we'll have to wait and see. As with General Kellogg's visit to Kiev, this is very good. because the United States has not participated as much as I would hope recently in the Ukraine contact group meetings in Brussels regarding weapons deliveries to Ukraine. But it's good that Kellogg is showing that America is still committed to Ukraine. Zelensky had a phone call with Trump just a day or so ago, so that channel is open. And I suppose what Kellogg can do is, again, usefully see what the battlefield situation is, what the most immediate requirements of Ukraine are for ammunition, anti-tank weapons, air defenses, long-range artillery, and play that role of coordinating the American supplies via Europe to Ukraine as quickly as possible. The other thing is that there's been a drone deal between Washington and Kiev, whereby the Americans are going to buy Ukrainian drones for $30 billion and also invest in Ukraine's defense industries. This is also a good thing. It has to happen quickly. So hopefully the Kellogg visit to Kiev can expedite all of those military supply issues, which, as I said previously, are really the key to ending this conflict and not so much the sanctions or diplomacy at the moment.
Donald Trump said he's frustrated with talks with Putin, and one day Putin talks about ceasefire, and the next day he bombs Ukrainian cities. So my question is, why does Trump keep trying to talk to him, even through official channels like Stephen Witkoff in Moscow?
Well, indeed. I mean, I think Trump still does see himself as the peacemaker. You know, he still has that aspiration to win the Nobel Peace Prize. He's made it clear that he wants his legacy to be the person who ends conflicts, not just in Ukraine, but of course in Gaza. You know, he's also claimed a role, correctly or maybe in an exaggerated way, but he's claimed a role in sort of dealing with conflicts in the Congo between India and Pakistan and so on. So that's what he wants, I think, his legacy to be. And I think, therefore, you know, he is quite desperate to keep some sort of channel of communication open that could build a peace. But on the other hand, there's the grim reality, as I was saying a moment ago, that Putin has largely ignored him. And in fact, during Trump's period in office, has intensified his attacks against Ukraine, and the number of Ukrainian casualties has risen accordingly. So it's really, I suppose, a battle in Trump's mind between the emotional, aspirational side of peacemaker and the realpolitik side of recognizing hard facts and the fact that Putin is playing him. And Trump has admitted publicly that Putin is playing him, that he's lying to him on the telephone, he's not keeping his promises. Trump has been expressing his frustration. But on the other hand, the problem with Trump is that he doesn't show much conviction about what he's doing. Instead of giving weapons directly to Ukraine, he's selling them to the Europeans and then waiting for the Europeans to transfer them to the Ukraine, which is obviously going to slow down the process. And even vis-a-vis sanctions, he said, well, the Russians are clever people. They're wily, to use his phrase. It's not quite clear sanctions are really going to work. So the key thing is that if he is now going to support Ukraine, he does it with greater conviction and a greater sense of purpose, and stop this kind of hopping one moment to the Kremlin, the next minute to Kiev, then back to the Kremlin, which I think reduces the credibility of not just of his military support for Kiev, but reduces his leverage on Russia, which doesn't take him seriously any longer, and the force of his diplomacy. If you want to get somewhere in life, you have to take your side and you have to pursue your course with conviction and courage.
It's interesting, just a year ago, the US was playing a leading role in sending new weapons to Ukraine, and now it seems they've stepped back. With no decisions yet on aid packages for 2026, is supplying weapons to Ukraine still a priority for Washington?
It's getting better, yes. I mean, after a difficult period, you remember during Trump's 6 months in office, there were two halts of arms deliveries to Ukraine, which sent, I think, a bad signal to Vladimir Putin and encouraged Putin to continue his aggression. What we have now is good in the sense that Trump is agreeing to supply US weapons to Ukraine, but they have to be bought by Europe. The good news here is that yesterday we had two announcements announcements, one from the Netherlands and one jointly from three Scandinavian NATO allies, Norway, Sweden and Denmark, that together they will produce 1 billion euros to buy American Patriots and American air defense systems, anti-tank weapons, etc., from US stocks to send to Ukraine. And hopefully other allies are going to contribute to this program in the next few days, which will be operated by NATO collectively. Germany has agreed to send 2 Patriot batteries. Also, the Pentagon has paused deliveries of Patriots to countries like Switzerland to give priority to deliveries to Ukraine. So we are seeing a bit of a shift, a bit of a turnaround in the United States. But as I've said, because it's dependent on the Europeans coming up with the money, it's bound to be longer and slower than the old system under the Biden administration, which is that Congress would allocate packages which the Pentagon could then deliver directly to Kiev from American stocks. But, if you've got half a cake, it's not as good as all a cake, but it's certainly better than no cake at all.
Yeah, you already started talking about Europe's role, and I want to continue this topic. Actually, my question is, do you think European military aid to Ukraine basically is enough? I'm not talking about winning the war, but at least keep fighting. And actually, when the current package approved under Biden administration runs out, where will Ukraine stand in terms of military equipment?
Well, Europe is certainly doing more, which is good. For example, the Kiel Institute in Germany for the world economy, as you probably know, because it's quite famous, does an assessment of weapon supplies to Ukraine. And this week it published its latest report, which shows that Europe has supplied $72 billion worth of weapons to Ukraine since Putin's second invasion. The United States, $65 billion. So Europe has now overtaken the United States by a considerable margin in terms of deliveries. I mentioned those German Patriots. You've seen Europeans collectively supply F-16 aircraft. Many other consortia, like the one organized by the Czech Republic, have been buying up 155mm ammunition for Ukraine. There's been a lot of European initiatives and packages that have been announced, for example, at the NATO summit in The Hague a couple of weeks ago, to keep Ukraine in the fight. But the problem is that Ukraine is fighting largely with American weapons, F-16s, ATACMS, HIMARS, long-range weapon systems, M1 Abrams tanks, and so on. And so even if those weapons come from European stocks, they are American weapons which require American spare parts, American maintenance, American ammunition, and so on. And of course, it's also the case that if all of NATO, all 32 countries, including the United States, are collectively behind the effort to keep Ukraine in the war, this is always going to be massively better than if Europe tries to do it alone or if the United States tries to do it alone. So it's very important that they work together. And as I've said, recently the Americans have shown a greater sense of urgency. We were speaking about the Kellogg visit. We were talking about the US-Ukraine drone deal, the American investment in Ukrainian defense industries, making greater use of NATO, of course, and the American Supreme Allied Commander Europe to coordinate the supplies. So we've got a better basis now than we had a couple of months ago, but there has to be more and it has to be faster.
And my last question, one I just have to ask. Belarus and Russia are set to hold joint military exercises known as Zapad 2025, or in English, West 2025, this September. How much of a threat do these drills pose to NATO's eastern flank? And is NATO ready to respond?
Well, When I was at NATO, you kindly referred to my old job at NATO, Sofia, when you introduced me. We had Zapad, and I remember at the time it was organized in Belarus, and a Russian general came to NATO and told us not to worry. It was a little counter-terrorism exercise in Belarus. There would be no major exercise, no major deployment of troops. We could go back to sleep and not worry. And of course, when we discovered the reality, and this was before Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it was a large-scale exercise involving the rehearsal to use nuclear weapons against NATO countries. So the Russians were trying to pull the wool over our eyes. Now, of course, the Zapad today is not going to be this kind of fictitious counter-terrorism exercise. It's going to be a much more major Russian mobilization, where, of course, NATO will be the adversary. So, to some degree, it's going to be easier, therefore, for NATO to track this and to see to what degree the Russians are planning, have the capability to launch a serious attack against NATO. You know that some NATO generals and politicians, like the French chief of defense, just this last week have been warning of a possible Russian attack against NATO in as little as 5 years. So NATO will be studying this closely. But of course, because Russia is so enormously involved in Ukraine at the moment, with over 600,000 Russian troops, what capacity they really have in an exercise like Zapad to demonstrate that they have the wherewithal, the capacity to attack NATO, that's going to be an interesting question. But all of this, of course, does have consequences for Ukraine, because the more Putin can sort of establish that he's able to pose a threat to the West, the more some NATO countries, particularly the Baltic states and Poland, say, well, should we really be helping Ukraine so much when we need to improve our own defenses? For example, yesterday, Lithuania asked NATO to increase its air defenses in Lithuania because a Russian drone landed in Lithuania this past week. So from NATO's point of view, the greater perception of a threat from Russia, the greater the balancing act that NATO has to do between helping Ukraine, which is fundamental for its security, but also making sure that it's improving the air defense, the ammunition stocks, the fighting ability of its own troops on the eastern flank. You have to, as an American president famously put it, you have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Thanks a lot for your insights, Mr. Shea.
Thank you, Sofia. And please, everybody in Kiev, stay with it. Courage.
Thank you all for watching War and Politics. If you like the show, hit like and subscribe to follow our latest episodes.